John Wilkes Booth was born on the 10th of May, 1838, near Bel Air, Maryland, at a rural estate known as Tudor Hall. He was the ninth of 10 children born to Junius Brutus Booth, a renowned English-born Shakespearean tragedian actor, and Mary Ann Holmes Booth, his common-law wife. The Booth family was deeply immersed in the theatrical world, and several of John Wilkes Booth's siblings, including Edwin Booth, achieved prominence as professional actors. Booth was named after John Wilkes, the 18th century British radical and parliamentarian, admired by his father for opposing tyranny. The namesake later took on symbolic meaning as Booth developed an intense ideological fixation on perceived oppression by centralized authority. Although raised in a cultured household, Booth's formal education was inconsistent. He attended local schools and briefly enrolled at St. Timothy's Hall, a military academy located in Catonsville, Maryland, but showed little interest in academic discipline. Instead, he gravitated toward physical activity, horsemanship, and theatrics. And by adolescence, Booth had begun to exhibit emotional volatility, impulsiveness, and a romanticized sense of humor and heroism. Entry into the theater and acting career. Booth made his official stage debut in 1855 at the age of 17 in Baltimore. Initially overshadowed by his brother Edwin, he worked steadily to establish his own reputation. While Edwin Booth became known for intellectual depth and refined classical performances, John Wilkes Booth cultivated a different persona, intense, physically dynamic, and emotionally charged. And by the late 1850s and early 1860s, Booth had become a popular manatee idol. Particularly admired by female audiences, he frequently performed Shakespearean roles as Richard III, Romeo, and Brutus, as well as melodramatic parts common to the era. Critics often described him as electrifying, but uneven, relying more on passion and physical presence than technical precision. Booth toured extensively throughout the U.S., including both northern and southern cities. These travels exposed him to the growing sectional crisis and further radicalized his personal political views. John Wilkes Booth was an ardent Southern sympathiser and a firm believer in white supremacy and the institution of slavery. Although he was a resident of Maryland, a border state, he strongly identified with the Confederate rebellion cause. Booth viewed the Civil War as an unjust assault on Southern society and believed that Abraham Lincoln represented tyranny and racial upheaval. He openly supported the Confederacy, expressed admiration for Confederate leaders, and despised abolitionists with a passion. Booth regarded enslaved African Americans as inherently inferior and opposed emancipation vehemently. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and later his support for limited black suffrage, deeply enraged the racist Booth, convincing him that drastic action was justified in the long run. Booth's worldview blended political extremism with theatrical romanticism. He saw himself as a historical actor, a man designed to perform a dramatic deed that would alter the course of history in the long run. Conspiracy against President Abraham Lincoln. By 1864, Booth began organizing conspiracy initially aimed at kidnapping President Abraham Lincoln, not taking his life. The plan was to seize President Lincoln and exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war. Booth recruited several co-conspirators, and these individuals were the following: Lewis Powell, otherwise known as Lewis Payne. He was a former Confederate soldier. David Herold, he was a clerk who was very familiar with Southern Maryland, a border state. George Atzerodt, a German-born laborer. John Surratt, a Confederate courier, and Mary Surratt, who was John's mother, an owner of a Washington, D.C. boarding house that served as a meeting place. The kidnapping plot eventually failed, reportedly due to poor planning and changes in Lincoln's schedule. As the Confederacy collapsed in early 1865, Booth grew increasingly desperate. the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. On the 14th of April, 1865, just days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse across the Potomac River in Virginia, Booth resolved to assassinate President Lincoln. Learning that the president would attend a performance of Our American Cousin, a performance of which Booth was personally familiar with and had personally participated in before at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Booth devised a coordinated attack upon the sitting president. The broader plot included Booth himself assassinating the president, Lewis Powell attacking his Secretary of State, who was known as William H. Seward, and George Atzerodt, the German-born Confederate courier, assassinating his vice president, who was known as Andrew Johnson. Only Booth succeeded, and by approximately 10:15 that evening, Booth entered the presidential box at Ford's Theater and shot President Lincoln in the back of the head with a .44 caliber Derringer pistol. Booth then leaped to the stage, breaking his leg in the process of this all, and reportedly shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the Virginia's state motto before escaping. President Lincoln died the following morning on the 15th of April, 1865. Flight and death. Booth fled across the Potomac River into southern Maryland with David Atzerodt, where they subsequently received assistance from Confederate sympathizers that included a man by the name of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated Booth's broken leg. And after nearly 2 weeks on the run, Booth and Herold were cornered on the 26th of April the same year at the Garrett Farm near Port Royal, Virginia. Union soldiers surrounded the tobacco barn where Booth was hiding. Herold eventually surrendered, but Booth refused. The barn was set on fire to force Booth out, and during the standoff, Sergeant Boston Corbett, who was English-born, shot Booth through the neck, paralyzed and mortally wounded Booth, who was eventually dragged from the barn and died several hours later, reportedly uttering the words that are officially on the record as "useless, useless." Booth was only 26 years old. In the wake of the assassination, 8 conspirators were tried by a military tribunal. Four of those were Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, and David Herold and George Atzerodt. They were subsequently executed. Others received lengthy prison sentences. John Wilkes Booth's actions forever linked his names to one of the most traumatic events in American history. His assassination of Abraham Lincoln transformed him from a moderately successful actor into a symbol of political extremism and national tragedy. Ironically, Booth's legacy cast a long shadow over his family, particularly his brother Edwin, who became America's most respected actor and spent the rest of his life publicly repudiating his brother's crime. Today, John Wilkes Booth is remembered not as an artist, but as a radicalized ideologue whose belief in violence as political theater culminated in the murder of a sitting president at a pivotal moment in the nation's history. That just about wraps up today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please leave a comment down below, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. It's much appreciated. Until next time, this has been your host, B9400 Ben Discusses History.